In 2007, TV network CBS dropped 40 kids in the middle of the New Mexico desert as part of a brand new reality show. These kids would have to build their own society from scratch. And if this sounds like Lord of the Flies to you, well, it was meant to.
We were on this mission together, and we were going to prove to the world that we could make a better society than adults could.
I'm Josh Gwynn, and I want to know what this wild TV experiment was really about. Split Screen, Kid Nation, a 6-part podcast from CBC. Available now.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
I often say that I love this job. It's the best job I've ever had, and I would have no problem doing it until I die. Which I might have to. And you might have to do yours till you die, too. The concept of retiring at 65 to live out our years in leisure and relaxation, that's an option afforded to fewer and fewer people. And among those just starting out in their working lives, people who are taking on debt to afford everything or barely keeping their heads above water, saving anything for retirement can feel like a total impossibility. So, is it? That's this week on In This Economy.
Imagine visiting yourself in the future.
Hey! Still in the rat race? Hey, you're me. At 55. We look pretty good. Well, retirement agrees with me. Retirement? How can we afford that? Freedom 55.
London Life.
Freedom 55. There are a lot of things about that classic 80s commercial that did not age well. Primarily, the fact that for most of the kids who happened to watch it on TV back in the day, it turned out to be a big lie. Many of us, who are now approaching that apocryphal age of 55, would grow up to worry that not only would they not be able to retire by 55, but, in this economy, are worried we might not be able to retire at all. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings, and you are listening to In This Economy, where we help you understand the systems that create your money problems, from grocery bills to pension plans to never stopping working until you die, and everything in between. In each episode, we hear from a listener who is facing a financial challenge, and then I talk to an expert who can explain the factors causing that problem and offer, if not perfect solutions, then pivots or options, things you can do, even in this economy. A listener named Brian recently wrote in with a question that is probably on a lot of people's minds. Here's what he said. Hello. Love the podcast. At 44, and as either the youngest Gen X or the oldest millennial, depending on the source, I've been almost subconsciously paying more attention to the doom and gloom articles regarding retirement in Canada. Is it even possible to retire, and what does an alternative retirement even look like? Brian's email included a link to a Daily Hive article that cites a Reddit thread where someone posed the question,
when living in an expensive Canadian city, do you think you can afford to retire at 65?
A lot of folks on that thread weighed in with what I would call bleak responses.
65? I'll be lucky if I can retire at 95.
I'm 42. At my current trajectory, I can expect to retire comfortably at age 275.
I swear, I'm going to work until 12 p.m. on the date of my funeral. Retirement is now only a thing for the rich.
So, we wanted to find out more about how attitudes towards retirement have been changing over the years. And if, rather than either retire or not ever retire, there might be a better way. So we reached out to Alyssa Brierley. She is the executive director of the National Institute on Aging at Toronto Metropolitan University. She co-authored their annual report, Perspectives on Growing Older in Canada. Alyssa, I will be blunt off the top. Are millennial Canadians going to be able to retire, like most of them even?
I think so. I mean, it's something that I think about myself because I fall into that age cohort as well. I think your listener question identified themselves as a 44-year-old, and that's the age that I am at right now. So I'm thinking about these things myself. But yes, I think retirement is absolutely in the cards for people. They just need to be thoughtful and plan for it. It's a major financial undertaking and a shift into a different phase of life. So it just requires careful planning.
What will that retirement look like, maybe compared to what our parents or their parents were used to, sort of since the rise of the unions, I guess, when it seemed to be like 65 and you're good, and maybe even if you work hard, 55 and you're off to the golf course?
I think certainly the concept of retirement has evolved and is continuing to evolve significantly. The traditional concept of retirement where you get to age 65 and go sip cocktails on the beach is not really realistic for people. We live too long for that, frankly. The average life expectancy is 79 for men and close to 84 for women. So
right.
It's not terribly surprising, given the major changes to longevity that we've seen over the last century, that our views on retirement are evolving. So I think at a high level, it doesn't look like what it looked like for our parents necessarily, but it's also the case that that's not necessarily what people want anymore. A lot of people, according to Stats Canada, want to continue doing some kind of work well beyond the traditional retirement age. And the majority of people planning to retire would continue working longer if they could reduce their hours and their stress.
So when you talk to Canadians, what are the concerns they have as they age and look towards retirement? Just saying I can't afford it is a very broad statement. What are they really worried about?
So the major concerns that Canadians have as they age and they look to retirement, they are primarily financial in nature.
Right.
So in particular, we heard that Canadians are concerned about the impact of inflation, the fear of running out of money in retirement, as well as the cost of care that they might need as they age, including long-term care. And I can break all that down a little bit if it's helpful.
Sure.
In our survey, we asked Canadians over 50 who haven't yet retired if they felt financially prepared to retire when they want to. And only 35% of working Canadians 50 and over who intend to retire said that they could afford to do so at their desired time. 39% said that they're not in the financial position to do so. And 26% said that they were unsure of whether they could afford to retire at their desired time. So I'll caveat all of that by saying that we don't know why people feel that way. It could be that they have money, but they're not sure if they have enough. It could be that they have money, but they're more aware of and concerned about the cost of aging. It could be that they aren't sure how to manage their money when they do retire. So just on that note, for people who have defined benefit pension plans, they don't have to worry about managing their money in retirement because the pension plan does that for them and guarantees an income for life. But that's not the case for people with retirement savings in other types of vehicles like defined contribution pension plans or RSPs or TFSAs. So it's a little bit more precarious for those folks in terms of managing their money.
Right.
But we, in addition to asking that sort of broad question, we also identified 9 future financial concerns and asked Canadians 50 and over to identify which ones were of concern to them when they thought about their future. And not surprisingly, given the economic trends in recent years, inflation is a top concern for people, with the rising cost of living named as the top concern, followed by running out of money. And then other issues that were identified include possible reduction in government benefits and not being able to afford major medical or long-term care expenses.
One of the things you mentioned was their money not lasting. This is a question that I've got myself, which is, given the volatility that we've seen in the economy the past few years, how do you look at how much you'll need to save for retirement and trust it, when we see the cost of everything, especially housing, can skyrocket so quickly?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think just at a high level, when people are planning for retirement, they need to keep in mind that they're living longer lives. They're in an environment of less secure retirement income from workplace pension plans. There's lower anticipated financial market returns and higher projected costs for things like healthcare and caregiving support. So there really is a lot to think about. We're often asked if there's sort of a number or a target or a sort of a magic number.
I was going to ask you that myself.
Yes, it's a very common question that people need to retire comfortably. And unfortunately, there really isn't a magic number. People need to understand what their expenses are and prepare for those costs. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about that if it's helpful.
Yeah.
So just off the top, only about a third of working Canadians have some form of workplace pension coverage. And we do have Canada's retirement income system, which provides all older Canadians with a base level of retirement income. But for most people, it doesn't provide enough money to fully cover living expenses and unexpected costs. So that's something that's really important for people to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm.
What your expenses will look like really depends on a number of different factors that are all really quite personal to the individual. So, what do you want your life to be like when you retire? What does comfortable mean to you? Where do you live? What is your health status? Do you have a solid network of friends and family who can help you out if you need help?
Mm-hmm.
What assets do you have? Do you own a home? So it's really important for people to understand what their expenses might look like when they retire. And in addition, there's a couple of other things to keep in mind. First of all, your expenses today may not necessarily be your expenses tomorrow.
Right.
And there's also a common misperception out there that when you're looking at financing your retirement, you'll spend most of your money up front on things like traveling and living your best life. But the reality is that the cost of aging can be significant, and those costs tend to increase as we age, as people need more care and support. So, many people think that their expenses will go down when they retire because they don't have a mortgage, which is one thing to think about. But as people age, healthcare expenses tend to increase.
Mm-hmm.
This can include, health insurance premiums that people will start to have to pay out of pocket after they retire because they don't have an employer paying for that. Deductibles, co-payments for health expenses, prescription drugs, dental, vision, long-term care, et cetera.
Right.
When it comes to care, traditionally and up to today, it's adult children who are providing the majority of care at home for Canadians. So 3 out of every 4 hours of care is being done by people's adult children.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't have children, or you have a smaller family, or your family doesn't live close to you, you may not be able to rely on that unpaid care and have to pay for that out of pocket. And the average cost of private in-home care services can range anywhere from $1,000 to $3,500 per month. But 49% of Canadians who are 45 years and older believe that the in-home care for themselves or a loved one would cost less than $1,100 a month.
Huh.
There's a huge disconnect between what people's actual care costs are and what they think they will be. In addition to the care needs, as people age, they might need assistance and support with what we call activities of daily living. So things like snow removal, gardening, and cleaning.
Right.
They also need to think about home maintenance and renovations, because we know that virtually all Canadians want to age in their homes as opposed to move into institutional care settings. But in order for that to be a reality, people need to plan for expenses to renovate their homes and make modifications for accessibility and to accommodate aging in place. And then going back to housing, which is where I started, people think expenses go down when you retire because they sort of assume that many people no longer have a mortgage. But if you're a renter, that assumption goes out the window entirely. If you're a renter, housing will be one of your biggest costs. And I imagine your listeners are likely quite attuned to the high cost of rental housing in Canada with our record low vacancy rates and record high rents.
So let me ask you this then, because, and I swear I'm not trying to be dour here, but you've not made retirement sound like living my best life and traveling the world. Is how we think about retirement changing? You kind of touched on this a little bit off the top, but if we're looking at saving for retirement and I'm listening to you and taking into consideration all of those things, I'm not actually thinking that I'm, going to be lying on a beach somewhere sipping a margarita. I'm going to be worried about affording my house, affording my medical care. Why would I want to retire?
That's a great question. I think I certainly don't mean to paint, an impossible picture of retirement for people. But I do think it is important that people understand and are realistic about what the costs of getting older entail so that they can plan for them and enable the kind of retirement that they want to have. A lot of people find themselves thinking about these things later than they should be. So it's really important that people start thinking about and planning for retirement sooner rather than later if that's what they want to do. So, doing things like taking steps to improve their financial literacy and educate themselves, learn and read and think about what their expenses will be while they're older and not make assumptions about what that looks like. But, as I was saying earlier, to your point, our concept of retirement, has changed over the years. There are a lot of folks who want to continue doing some kind of work well beyond the traditional retirement age if they could, reduce their hours and their stress.
Right.
Some of the reasons why they're working longer are, due to financial need, unfortunately, so some people don't have adequate retirement savings or they want to supplement their retirement income. And we think, under the circumstances that this trend is likely to increase given what we've seen in the results of our annual survey. But there is also a segment of the population of older adults who want to continue working because they're healthier and more active and they enjoy contributing and they enjoy the social interaction and the routine of working. And we've also removed one of the biggest structural barriers to working later in life, which is the elimination of mandatory retirement ages back in the 90s. So I think it really depends on, it's a very personal decision. What do you want your life to be like when you're entering, your later years? And for many people, they want a traditional retirement. And for many people, they want to continue working.
In 2007, TV network CBS dropped 40 kids in the middle of the New Mexico desert as part of a brand new reality show. These kids would have to build their own society from scratch. And if this sounds like Lord of the Flies to you, well, it was meant to.
We were on this mission together, and we were going to prove to the world that we could make a better society than adults could.
I'm Josh Gwynn, and I want to know what this wild TV experiment was really about. Split Screen, Kid Nation, a 6-part podcast from CBC. Available now.
I know you probably won't have a concrete answer for this. I think even a personal financial advisor might not have much to say to somebody in this predicament, but there are probably people listening to this right now and thinking, I would love to invest in my future self, but my present self has to eat.
Mm-hmm.
And how should I think about retirement in that context when we're in the middle of an affordability crisis and people are worried about next month's rent or what happens when the lease runs out and can't really, afford to spare that much money for an RRSP or something else?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure that I have a good answer for that, to be honest. I can say that what you've described is reflected in the results of our annual survey as well. We did see clearly that Canadians are facing challenges when it comes to saving for their retirement. And one of the things that has a major impact on that is income adequacy. So we had 3/4 of Canadians over 50 who took our survey reported that their income is enough for them in 2023, but only 1/3 reported that their income is enough and at a level that they could save from it. And 39% said that it is just enough to avoid major problems. And 1 in 4 Canadians over 50 said that their income is not enough for them, so that they're either financially stretched or they're having a hard time. So income adequacy is a real challenge, to your point, in the here and now, needing to make ends meet, but also wanting to save for retirement. So when we hear that only, 1/3 of Canadians can save with their current income, it is understandable that people are worried about financing their retirement. And we also know that this is particularly acute and there's more financial vulnerability among certain population groups, in particular, those who have fair or poor health.
What are some other ways people could think about this or could be doing this? What are differing takes on what retirement might look like in the future, presuming, to your point, that life expectancy continues to go up? Like 65 is not that old now.
Yeah, absolutely. It is not that old. As I get closer to it every year, I have the same reaction myself. I mean, I think that there is, the sort of traditional pathway of learning, earning, and retiring, I think in the future, again, just what I was saying earlier about people's interests in wanting to stay attached to the workforce, in many cases out of interest and a desire to contribute, and in some cases out of financial need. I think what this looks like is really disrupting the traditional sort of linear pathway for our later years, moving away from, like I said, learning, earning, retiring to, learning, earning, learning some more, earning some more, maybe taking a break, go back to work, so long as your health allows you to do that. So certainly, more flexibility and just a real openness to a much more non-linear career path. There are certainly some challenges to this, of course. Workplaces aren't necessarily providing older Canadians with the opportunities that they're looking for. Many workplaces default to full-time employment and don't make part-time opportunities available. Workplaces don't often sort of accommodate people downshifting in their career. So moving from a more sort of senior management role to something less senior and part-time. But it's really important that workplaces start to think about how to accommodate this new reality, because people want it and older Canadians are looking for those opportunities. And one thing that a lot of people forget often is that older adults are one of the biggest cohorts of caregivers in the country. Many older adults are caregivers for aging parents, spouses, siblings, or friends. So they need the kind of flexibility that many employers aren't willing to offer in order to stay in the labor force for very practical reasons, as well as sort of aligning with their interests.
Last question then, is this something that we should expect to see a policy shift on in the coming years as the demographics kind of make this impossible to ignore for politicians?
I think so. I certainly think that there is room for policy shifts. I think there's also an opportunity for employers themselves to step up here. So, certainly adapting for greater age inclusion, thinking about age in the same way that they think about other areas of discrimination and take it seriously as a protected ground of discrimination. It really does seem to be kind of the last socially acceptable form of discrimination. Employers need to promote opportunities for older workers to return to the workforce if and when they want to do that. So again, that's, flexibility in work arrangements, whether it's part-time or remote, or creating sort of phased retirement programs. But the good news is, some of the things that are required to enable this for older adults are things that are good for a variety of people in the workforce. Everyone wants flexible work arrangements these days.
Right.
But we also know that there are groups who fare particularly better with flexible and part-time opportunities. So, parents of young children, women, persons with disabilities, people with care responsibilities. It's a great way to make our workplaces more inclusive generally. And I think that's something we can all recognize the value of in 2024. And I think as well, there's a role for government as well, to your point, in eliminating some of the structural barriers to ongoing labor force participation. So looking at things like pension eligibility criteria and the sort of incentives that those create in terms of moving people out of the workforce entirely. Can we look at ways of facilitating, people to take a part-time pension while working part-time, or doing more of a phased retirement? So I certainly think, there's lots of opportunities there, and I'm hopeful that given sort of the demand and the need for rethinking some of our traditional notions of retirement, that we'll see some movement on this front.
Alyssa, thank you so much for this.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Alyssa Brierley is the Executive Director of the National Institute on Aging at Toronto Metropolitan University. Thank you so much to Alyssa for sharing her expert knowledge with us. You can find out more about the NIA at niaging.ca. And thanks to Brian for writing in with the question that sparked this episode. If you have a money problem or just a question about navigating this economy, we want to hear from you. Many of you already know this, but for those who don't, the show relies on you emailing us at hello@itepod.ca or calling us to talk about your problem. You can do that by leaving a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You don't have to give us your real name, but you do have to give us real numbers, either the numbers you're working with on a spreadsheet or the number where we can actually reach you to call you back and talk about it. Now, before we go, I have a quick housekeeping note. We received some feedback about our recent episode about RRSPs that some of the information presented was confusing and inconsistent. So, we've updated those show notes for that episode to include a clarification as well as a link to more information. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to the listeners who wrote in about that episode. And if you liked this show and want us to keep making more of it, please share it with your friends and your enemies and people you are indifferent to. You can also rate and review and follow whatever your favorite podcast app allows you to do. I'm your host and your executive producer, Jordan Heath Rawlings. This episode was written and produced by Allison Broverman and Stephanie Phillips. The sound design was done by Christy Chan. Mary Jubrin is our digital editor. Diana Kay is our manager of business development. And together, we make up the Frequency Podcast Network, which is, indeed, a division of Rogers. Thanks again for listening, and we will talk to you next week on In This Economy.
In 2007, TV network CBS dropped 40 kids in the middle of the New Mexico desert as part of a brand new reality show. These kids would have to build their own society from scratch. And if this sounds like Lord of the Flies to you, well, it was meant to.
We were on this mission together, and we were going to prove to the world that we could make a better society than adults could.
I'm Josh Gwynn, and I want to know what this wild TV experiment was really about. Split Screen, Kid Nation, a 6-part podcast from CBC. Available now.